In the spring of 1962, while American families gathered around their dinner tables and children played baseball in suburban streets, a group of men in the highest echelons of the United States military sat in a secure room in the Pentagon and put the finishing touches on a document that would have changed the course of history. This wasn't a battle plan against a foreign enemy. This wasn't a defensive strategy to protect American soil. This was something far more sinister, something that strikes at the very heart of what we believe our government stands for. This was a detailed proposal to murder American citizens, to sink American ships, to terrorize American cities, and to blame it all on a foreign government to justify a war. The operation had a code name. They called it Operation Northwoods. And if you think your government would never even consider such a thing, I need you to understand something right now. They didn't just consider it. They planned it down to the smallest detail. They typed it up, they signed it, and they presented it to the Secretary of Defense for approval. This was a betrayal of the highest order, a conspiracy that reached into the very top of our military command structure. And the only reason you're sitting safely in your home today instead of living in a nation torn apart by a manufactured war is because one man, President John F. Kennedy, had the moral courage to say no.
The documents the government tried to bury, the memorandums they never wanted you to see, they tell a story that's almost too disturbing to believe. But these aren't conspiracy theories from some basement blogger. These are official, declassified Pentagon documents stamped with the seal of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by the highest-ranking military officer in the United States at that time, General Lyman Lemnitzer. For decades, these papers sat in classified vaults, hidden from the American people, who had every right to know what was being planned in their name. It wasn't until 1997, more than 30 years after the fact, that the truth finally emerged, when the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board forced the release of these files. And when researchers finally got their hands on these documents, when they read through the cold, bureaucratic language describing plots to kill Americans, the historical record of our government was forever changed. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. Every word is documented, verifiable, and absolutely true. And I can promise you this, by the time you hear what they were planning to do with a commercial airliner full of innocent passengers, you'll never look at your government the same way again.
To understand Operation Northwoods, you need to understand the world as it existed in early 1962. The Cold War wasn't just cold anymore, it was burning hot in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. Just months earlier, in April of 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion had ended in complete disaster. 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, had stormed the beaches of Cuba, expecting American air support that never came. President Kennedy, new to the office and still finding his footing, had refused to commit American forces to what he saw as a reckless adventure. The invasion collapsed in less than 3 days. Fidel Castro emerged stronger than ever, and the young president was left humiliated on the world stage. The military establishment, the intelligence community, the anti-Castro hardliners, they all blamed Kennedy for the failure. They believed that if only he had shown strength, if only he had committed American power fully, Castro would have fallen and Cuba would have been liberated. Instead, they now faced a communist regime just 90 miles from Florida, growing bolder by the day, increasingly aligned with the Soviet Union, and they were determined not to let politics stand in the way of removing Castro from power.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer, was a military man through and through. He had served in World War II, commanded forces in Korea, and rose to the highest military position in the nation. He was part of a generation that had fought real enemies, defeated fascism, and believed deeply in American military might as the solution to global threats. And to men like Lemnitzer, Cuba, under Castro, wasn't just a geopolitical problem. It was an insult, a communist dagger pointed at the heart of America, a challenge to everything they had fought for. The problem was that after the Bay of Pigs disaster, President Kennedy had made it clear he wasn't interested in another military adventure in Cuba. He wanted diplomatic solutions. He wanted containment. He wanted anything except another embarrassing failure. But Lemnitzer and his team and the Joint Chiefs weren't ready to give up. They needed a way to force the president's hand, to create a situation so compelling, so outrageous, that even a reluctant commander-in-chief would have no choice but to authorize a full-scale invasion of Cuba. And that's when they started working on Operation Northwoods. What they put on paper would make you sick to your stomach. The memorandum itself, dated March 13, 1962, is titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba.
It's 15 pages of the most disturbing reading you'll ever encounter in official government documents. The language is clinical, almost casual, as if the authors were discussing routine military exercises rather than plots to murder their fellow citizens. The memo was addressed to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, one of the key figures in Kennedy's cabinet, a man who was supposed to be a rational voice in national security matters. The opening sections outline the political problem. How do you justify a military invasion when the American public isn't demanding one? How do you build support for a war when Congress is skeptical and the president is reluctant? The answer, according to the Joint Chiefs, was simple. You create an incident. You manufacture a provocation. You stage events that make war seem not just justified, but absolutely necessary. And the memo then proceeds to list in shocking detail exactly what kinds of incidents they had in mind. But before we get to those specifics, you need to understand something crucial. These weren't just abstract ideas or theoretical scenarios. These were operational plans with timelines, logistics, and detailed execution strategies. They had thought this through completely.
The planners of Operation Northwoods weren't thinking small. They proposed a coordinated campaign of terror and deception that would unfold across multiple American cities and involve numerous fake attacks designed to create maximum outrage and fear among the American population. One of the proposals involved staging attacks in Miami and other Florida cities. The plan called for the development of a communist Cuban terror campaign, as they phrased it, that would include bombing government facilities, sinking boats full of Cuban refugees, and creating casualties among the civilian population. They wanted to blow up ammunition depots. They wanted to sabotage ships in the harbor. They wanted to set fires in the city. And they wanted all of this to be blamed on Castro's agents, creating a wave of anti-Castro hysteria that would make invasion inevitable. The memo even suggested that they could create casualty lists in American newspapers, publish names of innocent Americans supposedly killed by Cuban terror attacks, and use that manufactured grief to build public support for war. Think about that for a moment. Your neighbors' names in the obituary section, memorial services for people killed by an enemy that didn't actually kill them. Grief weaponized by your own government.
Another proposal focused on the American military base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. The plan suggested staging attacks on the base itself, making it appear that Cuban forces were assaulting American military personnel on American-controlled territory. They discussed blowing up ammunition inside the base, starting fires, sabotaging aircraft on the runway, and even staging a fake attack on the main gate with friendly Cubans wearing Cuban military uniforms who would fire on American positions. The idea was to create the appearance of Cuban aggression to make it look like Castro had made the fatal mistake of attacking United States military forces, which would trigger an automatic and overwhelming American response. The cynicism is breathtaking. These were senior military officers calmly discussing how to attack their own bases, potentially killing their own soldiers to justify a war they had already decided they wanted. But as terrible as these proposals were, they pale in comparison to what was coming next, the plan that makes everything else look almost tame by comparison.
But the plan, most sick and twisted of all, the one that would make you question everything you know about your government, was still being refined in those Pentagon offices. This wasn't just about blowing up a few buildings or staging a firefight at a military base. This was about something that would generate the kind of emotional response that would make war absolutely inevitable. This was about making the American people believe that Cuba had committed an act so heinous, so unforgivable, that anything less than total military invasion would be seen as weakness. And to achieve that level of outrage, the Joint Chiefs were prepared to do something that still shocks researchers when they read it in the declassified documents today. The most elaborate and disturbing element of Operation Northwoods involved commercial aviation. The planners proposed a scenario that's almost impossible to believe until you read it in their own words in the official document. They wanted to create an incident that would convince the world that Cuba had shot down an American civilian aircraft. Here's how it would work, and I want you to pay close attention because the level of detail and deception involved will tell you everything you need to know about how far your government was willing to go. The CIA and military would secretly create an exact duplicate of a civilian charter aircraft. The real aircraft would be loaded with passengers, people who thought they were taking a normal flight, maybe heading to a vacation, maybe going to visit family, completely unaware they were pawns in a military deception. The plane would take off, and at a certain point during the flight, it would descend to a low altitude where it couldn't be tracked by civilian radar. At that moment, the duplicate aircraft, a drone painted with the exact same markings and registration numbers, would take its place at high altitude. The real aircraft, with the real passengers, would land secretly at a military base where the passengers would be given false identities and relocated. They would essentially disappear, their entire lives erased and rewritten by government handlers.
Meanwhile, the drone aircraft would continue flying toward Cuba, broadcasting fake distress calls about being under attack by Cuban fighter jets. The drone would then be destroyed, either by remote detonation or by actually having American jets shoot it down, and the wreckage would be scattered across the ocean. The world would believe that Cuba had murdered a plane full of innocent American civilians. The outrage would be immediate and overwhelming, and the United States would have its justification for invasion. Think about what this means for a moment. Think about the level of deception involved. They were planning to fake the deaths of American civilians, to create grieving families who didn't exist, to manufacture wreckage and debris, to coordinate false radar tracks and fake radio communications, all to trick the American people into supporting a war. This wasn't a contingency plan in case of actual aggression. This was a proactive scheme to fabricate aggression that didn't exist. And it was presented not by some rogue element or fringe group within the military, but by the Joint Chiefs of Staff themselves, the highest military authority in the nation, the men charged with defending American lives and American democracy. The same men who swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution were calmly proposing to make American citizens disappear and fake their deaths for political purposes. Let that sink in.
The memo also discussed smaller-scale provocations that could be used to build a case over time. They suggested harassing American aircraft and surface vessels, creating near-miss incidents that would keep tensions high. They proposed using submarine warfare tactics to sink Cuban ships and make it appear the Cubans had sunk themselves through incompetence or internal conflict. They even discussed the possibility of staging a fake Cuban attack on a neighboring country like the Dominican Republic or Haiti, which would allow the United States to intervene on a neighboring country like the Dominican Republic or Haiti, which would allow the United States to intervene as a protector of regional stability. Every scenario had the same basic structure. American military and intelligence personnel would commit acts of violence and destruction, careful precautions would be taken to blame Cuba, and the resulting outrage would be weaponized to overcome any political resistance to war. And here's what should terrify you. These plans included specific details about media coordination, about how to feed stories to journalists, about how to manufacture physical evidence that would withstand scrutiny. This wasn't amateur hour. This was professional-grade deception at the highest levels.
On March 13, 1962, this memorandum was formally presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. We don't have a complete record of that meeting, but we know from declassified documents that McNamara received the proposal and was expected to take it to President Kennedy for final approval. This is where the story takes a crucial turn, because what happened next reveals something essential about the character of John F. Kennedy and the nature of civilian control over the military. And you need to understand the pressure Kennedy was under at this moment. He had already been labeled as weak by the military establishment after the Bay of Pigs. He had hawks in his own administration pushing for aggressive action against Cuba. He had intelligence agencies telling him that Castro was a growing threat that needed to be eliminated. The easy path would have been to go along, to authorize at least some version of these operations, to let the military and intelligence professionals do what they claimed was necessary for national security.
Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods. He didn't just express concerns or ask for modifications, he flatly refused to allow it to proceed. There would be no fake terrorist attacks. There would be no staged shootings of civilian aircraft. There would be no manufactured incidents to justify a war he didn't believe was necessary or just. In Kennedy's view, the military served the Constitution and the American people, not the other way around. If the case for invading Cuba couldn't be made honestly, then the invasion wouldn't happen. And this decision, this moment of moral clarity, may have saved American democracy itself. Because if Operation Northwoods had been executed, if Americans had been killed or disappeared by their own government and war had been launched on false pretenses, the constitutional order would have been violated in a way that might never have been repaired. The precedent would have been set that the military intelligence establishment could manipulate reality itself to achieve its strategic objectives, regardless of what elected leadership or the American people wanted.
The rejection of Operation Northwoods had consequences within the military establishment. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the man who had signed off on this plan to attack American citizens, was not reappointed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when his term expired later that year. Kennedy effectively removed him from the center of power, reassigning him to a NATO command in Europe. It was a clear signal that the president would not tolerate military leaders who believed their judgment should override civilian authority, who thought that the ends of defeating Castro justified any means, no matter how immoral or illegal.
But Lemnitzer wasn't alone in his thinking. The memo had been approved by the Joint Chiefs as a body, meaning every senior military leader had signed off on these proposals. The institutional culture that produced Operation Northwoods didn't disappear just because one plan was rejected. And that should concern you, because those same institutional cultures exist today in different forms.
For more than 3 decades, the American people had no idea how close they had come to being victims of their own military's deception. The documents remained classified, locked away in Pentagon filing cabinets and military archives, stamped with classifications that ensured they would never see public light. The men who planned Operation Northwoods retired with honor, wrote memoirs that never mentioned this dark chapter, and took their secrets to the grave. If not for the work of the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s, if not for the push to release documents related to Kennedy's death and the era in which he governed, Operation Northwoods might still be hidden today. But in 1997, researcher James Bamford obtained the declassified Northwoods documents and published them in his book, Body of Secrets. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community of historians and journalists who covered military and intelligence affairs. Here was proof, undeniable and official, that the United States military had planned false flag operations against American citizens. And once that door was opened, once people understood that such plans had actually existed at the highest levels, it changed the entire conversation about government secrecy and institutional power.
The existence of Operation Northwoods raises profound questions that extend far beyond the specific events of 1962. If military leaders were willing to plan attacks on American citizens then, what does that tell us about the nature of institutional power? What does it reveal about the tensions between democratic accountability and national security bureaucracies that operate in secret? When we talk about the deep state, a term that gets thrown around in modern political discourse, we're often talking about exactly this kind of dynamic. Unelected officials in positions of permanent institutional authority who believe they know better than the elected leadership, who are willing to manipulate and deceive to achieve outcomes they've decided are necessary. Operation Northwoods is a textbook example of that phenomenon. The Joint Chiefs believed they knew what was best for America. They believed Castro had to be removed, and when the elected president disagreed, they didn't accept his decision. Instead, they plotted ways to manufacture the crisis that would force his hand. But here's the question that should keep you up at night. How many other operations like this were proposed over the years? How many were rejected? And more importantly, how many weren't? The emotional weight of this history is crushing when you really think about it. Imagine being an American in 1962, trusting that your government, for all its flaws, would never deliberately harm its own citizens. Imagine sending your child on a flight, watching the plane take off, and never seeing them again because the military had decided their death or their disappearance into a false identity program would be politically useful. Imagine living in Miami, hearing explosions in the night, reading casualty reports in the morning paper, mourning neighbors supposedly killed by Cuban terrorists, never knowing that the real killers wore American uniforms and took orders from the Pentagon. The violation of trust would be absolute and unforgivable, and that's exactly what was being proposed. The men planning Operation Northwoods understood that they were proposing to betray everything America claimed to stand for, but they justified it to themselves with the logic of national security. Castro was the real enemy, they told themselves. A few sacrifices now would save countless lives later. The ends justified the means. It's the oldest and most dangerous rationalization in the book, and it's the same rationalization that's been used to justify every abuse of power throughout history. What makes this even more chilling is that Operation Northwoods wasn't the only time such ideas surfaced. The memo itself references previous similar proposals, suggesting that this kind of thinking was part of an ongoing conversation within the military intelligence community. We know from other declassified documents that throughout the Cold War, various agencies proposed operations that involved deception, manipulation of public opinion, and even violence against civilians in third countries. The question that haunts researchers is whether any of these plans were actually implemented. Were there incidents during the Cold War that we accepted as genuine provocations that were actually staged? We may never know the full answer because so many documents remain classified even today, more than 60 years later. But Operation Northwoods proves that the capability, the willingness, and the institutional mechanisms existed to carry out such operations. The infrastructure was there, the mindset was there. The only thing standing between proposal and execution was the moral courage of civilian leadership to say no. The legacy of Operation Northwoods extends into our current era in ways that are both obvious and subtle. Every time a major terrorist attack or international incident occurs, there are those who immediately suspect government involvement, who see false flags and conspiracies everywhere.
It's easy to dismiss such thinking as paranoia, and often it is exactly that. But Operation Northwoods reminds us that the paranoid interpretation isn't always wrong. Sometimes the government really does plan operations to deceive its own citizens. Sometimes the conspiracy theories are actually conspiracy facts. That doesn't mean we should believe every wild claim that circulates on the internet, but it does mean we have an obligation to demand transparency, to question official narratives, and to remember that institutional power will always seek to expand and protect itself, often at the expense of truth and accountability. We owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to the Republic itself to remain vigilant and skeptical of power, especially when that power operates in the shadows.
President Kennedy's rejection of Operation Northwoods stands as one of the most important decisions of his presidency, though it's rarely discussed in mainstream histories. We remember Kennedy for the Cuban Missile Crisis, for his speeches about going to the moon, for his assassination in Dallas. But his refusal to authorize attacks on American citizens might be his most morally significant act as commander-in-chief. He faced enormous pressure from the military establishment, from intelligence agencies, from hardline anti-communists who believed he was soft on Castro. He had already been burned by the Bay of Pigs disaster and was desperate to avoid appearing weak. But when presented with a plan that violated every principle of democratic governance, he said no. He understood that some lines cannot be crossed, that some methods are incompatible with the values we claim to defend, and that a victory achieved through such means would be a defeat for everything America was supposed to represent. And maybe, just maybe, that moral stand is part of why certain forces wanted him gone. That's a topic for another time, but the connection is worth pondering.
In the final analysis, Operation Northwoods is a story about power and its limits. It's about what happens when institutions dedicated to national security begin to see the very citizens they're supposed to protect as acceptable collateral damage in larger strategic games. It's about the essential role of civilian oversight in preventing military authority from becoming military tyranny. And it's about the fragility of truth in an age of classified information and institutional secrecy. The men who planned Operation Northwoods believed they were patriots. They probably died believing they had served their country honorably. But what they actually did was propose mass murder and deception on a scale that would have destroyed American democracy from within. The fact that their plan was stopped doesn't erase the fact that it was created, approved at the highest military levels, and presented to civilian leadership as a serious proposal. That institutional capacity for evil didn't disappear when the plan was rejected. It remains embedded in the structures of power, waiting for circumstances and personalities that might allow it to surface again.
This is why we tell these stories. This is why declassified documents matter. This is why an informed citizenry capable of questioning authority is essential to maintaining a free society. Operation Northwoods happened. It's not a theory or speculation. It's documented historical fact. And if it could be planned once, it could be planned again, under different circumstances, with different justifications. The price of freedom really is eternal vigilance, not just against foreign enemies, but against those within our own institutions who believe they have the right to lie to us, manipulate us, and even kill us if they decide it serves a greater purpose they've defined in secret. Remember Operation Northwoods. Remember what your government almost did. Remember the names: Lyman Lemnitzer, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Pentagon planners who thought American lives were chess pieces to be sacrificed for geopolitical gain. And never stop demanding the truth, because the moment we stop asking questions is the moment they start getting away with it again.